I needed to cut a few half-lap joints for a table base, but I didn't feel comfortable using the table saw or radial arm saw for this project. I decided to make a template that would allow me to easily locate and cut the half-laps using a hand router. Before we cut the half-laps, we first have to make a template for the router to follow, and there are two ways I'm going to tell you about to do this. 1. Set up some temporary rails and stops on some scrap MDF or plywood to make your template out of, and then just run the router along the inside of those rails to make your pocket. 2. If you have access to a CNC, just have that cut the template for you. I recently added a shop bot to my shop, so here's my process on how I cut the template for the project. I got the CNC up and running and then fired up the vacuum pump to hold a piece of 3/4 inch MDF in place that the template will be cut from. And I isolate the vacuum to just the area of the table my workpiece is on. Since I'll do a bit of engraving on this piece, I set my Z0 axis to the top of the material instead of the machine bed, since sheet goods are notoriously slightly different thicknesses from one sheet to another. Next, a pretty important reminder, I put away the zero plate and remove the alligator clip from the spindle. After one last quick review of the toolpaths, I export the file from VCarve Pro and load the part file in the ShopBot command console. Up first is engraving, so the ShopBot picks up a V-bit and gets to work. I like to have notes about how to use a template engraved, that way I don't have to try and remember which bits or bushings I need to use. Next up, the machine changes tools and picks up a 3/8 downcut end mill to cut out the pocket that I'll follow with my hand router to cut the half laps. After that, the last tool change is to a 1/2 inch end mill. This tool change isn't completely necessary, but it does speed up the process of pocketing the area where the template will locate on the boards that the half laps will then be cut into. Once all of the cutting is done, the gantry rolls to the 0-0 position, turns off the spindle, and just hangs out until the next job. Since I didn't double check the thickness of the piece of MDF, there was a thin layer left behind that I needed to clean up, so I grabbed my hand router with a pattern bit and trimmed up the excess material. After a quick visit from the air hose, my template is ready for a test fit, and just to be sure, I check a couple of boards. Turns out I cut them a hair wider than I meant to. So over at the table saw, I take just a little bit off of each one of the boards. Except for that one. Oh, looky there, how convenient, a note. With the template registered on the board inside of the pocket, I clamp it in place and install the proper bushing and bit combination in my router. And since the base of my router is too small to cover up the opening in the template and would likely tip during use, I grab a scrap that was the right thickness and I use it to help support the router while I use the tool. At this point, I'm focusing on just the shoulders of the joint and I'm not cutting away all the material in the middle. If I had a longer bushing set that would allow me to also use my auxiliary router base, I would go ahead and cut the entire pocket at this time, but since I don't, this is the process I used. Once the shoulders are cut, I mark the ends of the template, which are my cut lines, for the overall length of the piece. Now I grab a Forstner bit and clear out the bulk of material, and I follow that up with a chisel to knock out what's left. Before I cut the other half of this joint, I laid a board in the pocket, and as you can see, there's a bit of a gap because apparently that tiny bit I trimmed off the board was just a tiny bit too much. I used a folded piece of paper to measure the size of the gap, and then I adjust my template so subsequent pockets will be tighter. Since the pocket was too big, I'm going to line the edges of the template with 2 layers of blue tape per side, which will give me the same thickness as the sheet of paper that I folded over 4 times. First, I seal the edge with thin Star Bond to help the tape adhere, and then I add 2 layers of tape and trim off the excess with a razor blade. I repeat the process on the other side of first sealing, then taping, and then trimming up with a razor blade. Also, just in case you're interested, you can use my discount code WSM15 over on Starbond's site to save 15% off of their products. With my template doctored up and clamped into position on the next board, I run back through the same sequence of cutting just the shoulders of the pocket first with the bushing and router bit combination. I then mark my cut lines for each end of the piece before removing the template and once again go into town with a drill and Forstner bit to remove the bulk of material. After I vacuum up all the shavings and knock out the remaining pieces with a chisel and mallet, it's time for another test fit and yep, that'll do nicely. Before I finish cutting the pocket to final depth, I first zero the router against the top of the material. I'll then plunge incrementally until I've cut halfway through the piece. For this operation, I've changed out the bit in my router for a top bearing pattern bit, and I've attached an auxiliary base plate as well. Once the pockets are finished in both pieces, it's time for another test fit to make sure the pocket depth is good and the joint is snug. One last thing to do before I glue up the joint is to sand the sides of each piece, because after this it'll be very tedious to sand these surfaces. So I make sure to avoid sanding the sides of the joint so that way I don't accidentally loosen the fit. Here I'm using my 5-inch Surf Prep sander. I use it because it balances easily on narrow surfaces and leaves a great finish. If you're in the market for a new sander and want to check out Surf Prep, you can use my code WoodshopMike10 at checkout and save 10% over at surfprep.com. When gluing up this joint, I want to do my best to not have excessive squeeze out in the corners because cleanup will be a bit difficult. So as I apply glue, I try to leave it a bit shy in those areas. I then use 4 Bessey heavy-duty trigger clamps to close up the joint, and I wipe away any excess before setting the glue up aside to cure. Make sure to catch the full build video for this table if you want to see how I finished up the base and the unique way that I attached the base and table to allow for easy assembly and disassembly. If you have any comments or questions, make sure to leave those below. I'll get back to you as soon as possible, and as always, have fun making something.